But, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about this idea of Eastern philosophy for a minute before we jump into that. You'll notice that as we looked through the Bhagavad Gita, that there was actually quite a bit of very deep philosophy contained within those pages. There were some specific things you were supposed to know and get out of it. Clearly, there's an ethical understanding that comes through it. There's a certain logic that comes through. And of course, what is the ultimate goal of philosophy in general? It's to find knowledge, right? It's to seek the absolute knowledge or the absolute truth. And so even though the approach and maybe the general outcome is a little bit different here for the Vedic philosophy than it is for what you're accustomed to in the West, the fact is you're still searching for that same thing. I want the absolute truth. Plato, for example, told us that the absolute truth was found in this realm of being, this other realm that exists out there, where everything was absolute and perfect and unchanging, and that this world was just a poor copy trying to emulate it. But it was a connection that we had that could help to elevate us to that other realm of pure understanding. Well, is that much different from what the Bhagavad Gita is teaching? It teaches us that Krishna is the absolute truth, the ultimate knowledge, the end of our endeavor. And there again, this world that we're living in is one that's temporary, one that's illusory, a poor copy, if you like. And it's an attempt to help us to elevate ourselves to that higher level of understanding. So you see these ideas that come through, and you can see, a little bit more in line of a pure form of philosophy when you read works like the Bhagavad Gita. But when you look at the Mahabharat at large, when you look at the Ramayana at large, you're seeing not so much of these deep philosophical concepts or ideas, because these were stories that were written, originally told, but later written for the common people, for the everyday individuals. Now, back at the very beginning, I talked about how Eastern philosophy differed from Western in the sense that in the Eastern philosophy, you do get a lot of these stories and aphorisms that are told to you. And the idea is that when you read it, it's going to say something to you based upon where you are at this present moment. Where are you in terms of your own position, your own understanding, your own background knowledge? What are you taking out of it? And as you read this piece now, you make something different from it than you would if you read it 20 years down the road. And so we have to keep that in mind, that this is kind of the way that the Eastern thought process works, is here are these concepts and these ideas, but I'm not going to blast them at you and say, here, this is what you've got to know, but rather it's there to unfold on your own conscience so that you're able to comprehend in that present moment based upon where you are. And it can speak to you differently from one moment to the next. So when we look at the Ramayana, even though I may stop and talk about certain philosophical ideas or draw links for you, the fact is that it really is an adventure story that's being presented to you, that it is something that can be read and understood simply for enjoyment. I think I mentioned that the televised recreation of this was and still remains the highest rated program in Indian television history. It's something that is very much there for people to enjoy, but it also speaks to a level of consciousness that, perhaps you can gain some of this understanding, some of this insight as you go through it. So these are stories for the masses, but there's insights that are going to come from those stories. So don't be shocked, don't be surprised, if it just seems like, hey, we're enjoying a good tale, and it doesn't seem like you're hearing any great philosophical insights. They're there, but you have to kind of wait for them to speak to you. So I just thought I'd throw that out there before we really got into it. But for right now, let me go ahead and pull up the screen here so we can get into the Ramayana. Now, I'm going to do a quick bit of review on a few things that are going to be relevant to your understanding of it, and then we'll jump into it. I will highlight some key passages from the text as we go along, but for the most part, I'm going to be kind of offering you a summary of the story of what's happening. And like I said, you can take what you can get from it now, what you're able to read from it now, that's wonderful. But it's 700 pages or so, and I don't think that you can probably read through that in a 2-week or so time period that we've got to cover this book in. So, if you stick it on a shelf and save it for summer, it'll make good summer reading while you're sitting on the beach. All right, so that being said, the first thing, of course, is just to remind you of Vedic literature in general, which I kind of did already. The original writings, the 4 Vedas, and then these other works, the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Mahabharat, and the Ramayana. So the Mahabharat and the Ramayana being the works that are intended for the common people, for the everyone, just to hope that they might get some of the ideas seeping through. The works like the Bhagavad Gita that came out of the Mahabharat, the Upanishads, the Puranas, they are for people who are on a slightly higher intellectual level. And then, of course, the Vedas were really for the Brahmanical castes of people. There are different levels of understanding that you can get depending upon what you approach the reading with. And so again, with the Ramayana, we are at the lowest level, really, for the common people. Many of them would simply have to sit and listen to these stories, being illiterate people themselves. I mentioned again the size of the Ramayana as well as the Mahabharat as well, so we don't need to dwell on that. We talked about how within this tradition there's the idea that is put forward by the Rigveda that truth is one, though the sages know it is many. All right, so there are a lot of different paths that a person can take towards liberation. There are a lot of different deities that exist, gods, demigods, and so on. But yet, in reality, there is only one, right? So we saw that idea of a henotheistic faith that we talked about previously. So those are important ideas that we still have to keep in mind as we go through this. The concept of Dharma, we talked about that with regards to the Bhagavad Gita. It's also a central theme in the Ramayana. Dharma is the supreme law of righteousness. It implies that there is an undeniable pattern to which all existence must adhere. It looks like my pictures and writing are melding together again. I don't know why they do that, but I'll put these up like I did the last one so you can look at them, so that you can look at them at your leisure and see the full writing, because when you just look at it, it will give you all the writing. For some reason, it gets condensed somehow when it comes up on this particular screen. But anyway, Dharma, as we saw, could imply a sense of morality. It could imply the idea of harmony within all. We saw it in the Bhagavad Gita as implying the concept of duty or an obligation. And so that's kind of the way you're going to see it here as well. That sense of duty is that supreme law of righteousness. There is an undeniable pattern to which all existence must adhere. There's a certain way, guidelines of sorts that have been set down by the gods and the sages in these ancient writings. And they prescribe a certain course of action. Now, as we saw in the Bhagavad Gita, human beings do possess free will. So if they choose to go against those instructions, they're certainly free to be able to do so. But in doing so, they're acting with adharma. They're acting contrary to the rule of Dharma. So if you want to maintain a proper balanced course of life, then you want to follow the Dharma that's been prescribed to you. And of course, we talked about the castes as well, and how each caste has their own particular Dharma to follow. For example, Arjuna, as the Kshatriya, had the duty to go into battle to fight a righteous battle for a higher cause. The Brahman has the duty to lead individuals with their intelligence, with their understanding, and so on. So this sense of duty is presented there. In fact, I don't think I did this the last time, so let me do it now. As soon as I find what I'm looking for. There it is. There's a Vedic text called the Laws of Manu. Manu is supposed to be the first human, the first sort of the father of all of humanity within this tradition. And so knowledge is given to Manu, and he constructs what becomes known as the Laws of Manu. And in there it talks about the duties, the obligations that are given to the individual castes. So let me just read through this for a moment. In order to protect the universe, he, the most resplendent one, assigned separate duties and occupations to those who sprang from his mouth, arms, thighs, and feet. To Brahmans, he assigned teaching and studying the Vedas, sacrificing for their own benefit as well as for others, the giving and the accepting of alms. So the Brahman has that basic duty to the intellectual pursuit. They are supposed to study the Vedas, they're supposed to teach them to others, they're supposed to set the example of sacrifice for others, and so on. They are the intellectual lead that will guide others on the right path. The Kshatriya, he commanded to protect the people, to bestow gifts, to offer sacrifice, to study the Vedas, to abstain from attaching himself to sensual pleasure. And so the warriors, the political leaders, the Kshatriya, they are there to practice the arts of warfare, to protect the population, to offer gifts to the population, to offer sacrifices. They also should, to some degree, study the Vedas as well. They are there for those purposes. The Vaishya are to tend cattle, to bestow gifts, to offer sacrifices, to study the Vedas, to trade, to lend money, to cultivate the land. And so the merchant class, the Vaishya, they are there to do those types of activities. And only one occupation the Lord prescribes to the Sudra, and that is to serve these other three castes. And so the lowest order, the lowest caste, the Sudra, is there essentially to do the work of society. They're the untrained common folk. And in many ways, those are the people for whom works like the Ramayana are written, because they're the ones who will be entertained by these stories, but still be able to gather at least a glimmer of that insight that they wouldn't be able to get because of a lack of understanding of the higher ideas through these other types of writings. The two epics that we were looking at, the Mahabharat, which again the Bhagavad Gita came from, and now the Ramayana, they provide paradigms in the form of detailed stories that illustrate the choices that people have to make. Things like education, marriage, child rearing, family relations, war, death, all of these concepts are talked about within these texts. We see the phrase a lot, this is my duty or my obligation. And of course, duty stems from the idea of the Vedas. Duty is an action that is essentially beyond choice because it's part of Dharma. By doing whatever is required, the individual is fulfilling their role as conscientious practitioners, people who are paying attention to the ebb and flow of the universe. Right? And so that action of Dharma is what governs all things.